Snow fell like a slow confession, each flake drifting in silence across the endless plains. The land stretched white and empty, as if the world itself had forgotten color, leaving only the sharp ache of wind and the sound of breath. In that wilderness, a man moved, broad as an oak trunk, shoulders bare against the storm, skin seared by sun and scar alike. His white hair, long and braided with strands of red cloth faded by years, streamed behind him like a banner of age and survival. He was known to no one anymore, save the winter and the bones buried beneath it. His name was Tahuya, though he had not spoken it aloud in years. Each step he took pressed deep into the drifts, yet he did not shiver. He had taught himself long ago that the cold was only another form of memory, one he could not banish but must endure. His people were gone, his kin claimed by fever, rifle, and hunger. The lodge he kept standing was less a home than a tomb of routine. Fire tended, wood chopped, hides repaired. The silence was not peace. It was punishment. From the rise above his land, he caught sight of movement. Two dark smudges staggering through the snow, bent low against the wind. For a moment, he thought them phantoms, the kind that came to him when he let the fire grow too dim. But as the smudges grew clearer, he saw they were women. Settlers, cloaked poorly, skirts heavy with frost. They moved like those who had walked too far on too little, their bodies driven by nothing but the thin thread of desperation. When they reached the shadow of his lodge, they collapsed together, their arms linked as though they were one body divided into two. He stood at a distance, snow rising on his chest, watching them. They were both white-haired, though not with his kind of years. Grief had carved its silver into their heads, not age. One woman, tall and sharp-boned, raised her face from the snow, her gray eyes bright with pleading. The other, fuller of figure but no less weary, clutched her shawl tight, whispering words that dissolved in the wind. "We have nowhere," the tall one managed, her voice raw. "They turned us away. Said we were too old to feed, too strange to keep. Please, shelter, only for a night." The words carried more weight than the snow. Tahuya said nothing. His silence was not cruelty. It was habit, a wall that protected him from the pain of remembering that once he had answered pleas and lost everything for it. He looked down at them, these two cast-offs of the town, their white hair a curse in a land that worshipped youth and strength. Their beauty lingered, yes, but beauty here was no shield. It only drew sharper tongues, crueler hands. The shorter woman, her cheeks burning red with cold, lifted her hand toward him, as though he were some vision she feared would vanish. "We will work. Chop wood, scrub floors, anything. Only, do not send us back into the dark." A crow called overhead, harsh against the snowfall. Tahuya turned, the ache of memory pressing into his chest. Years ago, women had stood before him too, his wife, his daughters, begging him not to ride into war, not to fight the white men who cut deeper than winter. He had not listened then. Now their voices lived only in the way the wind bent the trees. The two women trembled, kneeling in snow as if before judgment. Their bodies told their histories more clearly than their words. Hands blistered from labor, skirts frayed by hunger, faces lined not by years but by rejection. They had been deemed useless, their silver hair mistaken for frailty. The town spat them out, and now they found themselves before the last man alive on this lonely stretch of earth, a Comanche giant who owed nothing to them. Tahuya stepped closer, his breath visible in the air between them. The tall woman lowered her gaze, shame etched into her brow. The shorter one bit her lip, holding back tears. Neither dared move, as if the weight of his silence was heavier than the snow that buried their boots. He could have turned away. He could have let them sink into the white expanse and vanish like so many before them. It would have been easier. But something in their silver hair stirred him. It was not pity. It was recognition. They bore the mark of survival, of those who had lost much and still clung to the thin flame of breath. In them, he saw not weakness but kinship. A gust of wind rattled the lodge door behind him. He looked back at it, at the small fire waiting inside, the narrow space that had been his prison for decades. To share it would mean to disturb the quiet, to open himself to the eyes and voices of others once more. It would mean gossip in town, danger, the return of judgment. Yet to deny them would be to harden himself into stone, and stone could not bear the weight of memory forever. The tall woman's voice cracked once more. "We are Eleanor Vale and Martha Caro. Widows both. We mean no harm. Only a place to live through the night." Names. They had given him names, the one thing he had withheld from the world for years. Names were trust, a fragile offering in a land where most had forgotten what it meant to be seen. Tahuya let his gaze linger on them, the snow gathering at their lashes, the tremor in their fingers. His silence stretched long enough that Eleanor closed her eyes, whispering something like a prayer, perhaps believing that this was the end. Martha pressed closer to her friend, their shoulders touching like sisters bound for the grave. The giant shifted, his moccasins sinking deeper into snow. He reached for the door, his massive hand curling around the wood worn smooth by years of solitude. The creak of the hinges broke the silence like a rifle shot. Neither woman dared breathe. For one heartbeat, the open doorway was nothing but darkness, the unknown as vast as the blizzard beyond. Then Tahuya stepped aside, not speaking, not gesturing, but leaving the space open wide enough for them to see the fire's faint glow inside. The snow swirled harder, pressing at their backs as if urging them forward. Eleanor looked at Martha, tears bright in her gray eyes, and together they rose from the snow, their knees weak, their hearts pounding. They took one step toward the warmth, then another, and crossed the threshold into the cabin. Behind them, the wind howled through the plains, carrying the sound of distant laughter from the town that had cast them out. Ahead of them, silence waited once more, but no longer empty, no longer his alone. And as Tahuya closed the door, the fire flared, casting its glow across three faces marked by loss, silver hair catching the light like crowns of ash. In the hush of that small room, the world shifted, though none of them yet knew into what. The cabin breathed with the smell of smoke and wet wool. The women shed their cloaks, steam rising faintly from the fabric, while Tahuya fed another log into the fire. He moved with the silence of habit, his great hands deliberate, his presence filling the narrow room like a mountain fills the horizon. Eleanor and Martha stood near the hearth, the heat flushing their faces back to life. They did not speak at first, as if afraid words might disturb the fragile permission that had been granted to them. Outside, snow pressed against the walls in steady whispers. Inside, the silence lingered until Eleanor broke it with a voice made careful by gratitude. "You saved us from the night." She did not expect an answer, and none came. Tahuya only settled onto the low stool by the door, his broad chest bare, his braid gleaming white in the firelight. His eyes, dark and deep as river stone, gave no sign that her words had even reached him. Martha, braver with her tongue, set her hands to work. She untied a small bundle from her cloak and placed it on the table. 3 withered apples, a twist of flour wrapped in cloth. "What little we carried. We'll share it," she said. Her voice trembled on the edge of defiance, as though she dared him to reject even this small gesture. Tahuya did not touch it. Instead, he watched the flames curl upward, his silence holding the weight of years. As the hours unfolded, the women moved with instinctive diligence. Martha swept ash from the hearth, Eleanor stitched the edge of a frayed blanket. Neither asked permission. They acted as if work were the only language they had left, the only currency that could buy their place. Their movements stirred memories in Tahuya, ghosts of another time, when his wife had knelt by a fire, when his daughters had giggled softly in corners, weaving their braids with red string. For a moment, he almost heard their voices in the crackle of flame, but memory was cruel, and the silence returned heavier than before. Later, when hunger gnawed, Martha boiled the flour into a thin paste, sharing it equally among them. She slid the bowl toward Tahuya last, her hands hesitant. He accepted it without thanks, yet he did not look away from her. Their eyes met across the glow of the fire. Something unspoken passed, acknowledgement, perhaps, that survival was now a bond stronger than words. Night deepened. The storm outside grew wilder, snow lashing the shutters like claws. Eleanor lay awake near the fire, listening to its soft hiss. Martha slept beside her, her breath shallow but steady. Across the room, the giant sat upright, his back against the log wall, unmoving. He seemed carved of stone, yet she sensed he was not asleep. His eyes watched the flames as though guarding them from betrayal. Eleanor closed her own eyes and drifted into memory. Once, her house had been filled with laughter. A husband's voice, a daughter's song. Fever had taken them both in a single week, leaving her alone with white hair sprouting like frost overnight. Since then, the town had treated her as a burden, a reminder of death they did not wish to face. Her grief had become a mark against her. She had learned to keep her chin lifted, though every glance sliced like a blade. Martha's story was no kinder. Her husband had gambled away their land, then disappeared, leaving her with nothing but debts and whispers of shame. She had carried herself with pride until the gossip broke her spirit, until the cruel laughter of younger women forced her from the town's circle like a dog driven from the porch. In Eleanor's company she had found a sister of circumstance, someone who bore rejection with the same clenched dignity. They had wandered together until the snow forced them to Tahuya's door. Morning came muted, the storm slowed but not gone. Tahuya stepped out early, shirtless still, carrying his axe across one shoulder. Eleanor and Martha watched through the frost-rimmed window as he split wood with powerful strokes, each swing steady as a drumbeat. His body moved with a rhythm not of strength alone, but of long endurance. The women exchanged glances. They had been told Comanche were savages, yet here was a man who kept his land alive with the discipline of ritual. When he returned, frost glittering in his hair, Martha dared to ask, "Why live so alone?" Her voice was soft, not prying, but the question hung heavy. Tahuya did not answer. He placed the wood by the fire, sat, and reached for his knife to shape a new handle for the axe. The scrape of blade against wood became his reply. But Eleanor saw the shadow that crossed his face. It was the look of one who had lost more than he could name, whose silence was not stubbornness but grief made permanent. She wanted to ask more, but words felt fragile here. Instead, she set a bowl of hot broth before him, her hand brushing the table near his. He did not lift his eyes, yet his hand lingered close to hers a moment longer than needed. Later that day, they journeyed into town for supplies. Eleanor and Martha pulled shawls tight around their heads, their white hair hidden poorly. Still, whispers followed them through the store. Look at them, living under his roof. Witches, both of them. Silver hair cursed. The words slithered through the air like snakes. Eleanor kept her chin high, her hand gripping Martha's tightly. When they stepped outside, 3 men leaned against the post, smirking. "How's life in the Comanche's bed?" One spat. Martha flinched, her cheeks burning. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Before she could reply, a shadow fell across the snow. Tahuya stood behind them, silent, his height dwarfing all. His chest bore scars like maps of battles, his white hair whipped by the wind. He did not speak, he did not need to. The men's grins faltered. One spat into the snow and stepped aside. The walk back was quiet, but the women's hearts pounded with a strange mix of fear and awe. They had not been defended with words, yet never before had silence felt like such a shield. That night, Eleanor placed her sewing aside and looked across the fire. "You frighten them," she whispered. "But not us." For the first time, Tahuya's lips curled faintly, the ghost of a smile, though fleeting. Martha's laugh broke the heaviness for a heartbeat, fragile but real. In that small cabin, something had shifted. The silence that had once been a wall was beginning to take on another shape. Not only a boundary, but a language shared among the 3. Still, outside, the snow deepened, and the whispers of the town grew sharper with each passing day. As the wind rose again against the walls, Eleanor stared into the flames and wondered, not if they had found shelter, but what storm would come for them next. The thaw never came, though days dragged forward. Snow still clung to the valley, and the river's voice was muffled beneath ice. Within the cabin, the 3 moved like figures bound by unspoken covenant. Eleanor mended seams, Martha kept the fire breathing, and Tahuya worked the land with quiet endurance. Each task, though ordinary, carried a weight beyond survival. It was proof that they belonged, at least to one another. But beyond the walls, belonging was denied. The town had begun to hum with a sharper kind of talk, whispers that grew bold enough to reach ears unhidden. When Eleanor and Martha stepped into the general store one gray morning, they felt the air thicken around them. Eyes followed their steps as though they had tracked snow across a polished floor. A woman behind the counter pursed her lips. Strange sight, she muttered to no one in particular. Two widows with white hair finding comfort where they can. The words dropped like stones. Eleanor kept her head high, her spine rigid, but Martha's cheeks flushed crimson. Outside, the wind cut hard against their faces. 3 men lingered by the hitching post, voices thick with mockery. "Here tell they're sharing his fire," one said with a grin that reeked of cruelty. "And maybe his bed." Laughter cracked the cold air, sharp as whips. Eleanor's hand closed tight around Martha's arm, holding her still. Her pride burned hotter than the insult, but she knew answering would only feed the fire. Yet before she could pull Martha away, the laughter choked into silence. Tahuya stepped from the shadow of the alley, his frame towering, his breath visible in the cold. He did not raise his voice, nor his fist. He only stood, the scars on his chest bare beneath his cloak, his dark eyes holding centuries of grief. The men's smirks faltered, then slipped into muttered curses as they turned away. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her chin lifting. But inside, shame prickled like thorns. They would never escape the whispers. No silence, no work, no dignity could erase the town's judgment. That night, she sat by the fire, the needle trembling in her hand, and whispered to Martha, "They will not forgive us for surviving differently than they expect." Martha laid a hand on hers. "Let them talk. We know what truth is." Yet even Martha's voice carried the tremor of someone who had been burned too many times to believe fully. Tahuya sat across from them, sharpening his knife. His silence was neither approval nor dismissal, but it pressed into the space between them like stone. He understood the weight of judgment. His whole life had been carved by it. Yet seeing the women bare it reopened wounds he had buried deep. The days that followed carried more of the same. Whenever Eleanor or Martha ventured into town, stares followed like shadows. Children whispered witches behind their hands. A drunk spat in the snow at Martha's feet. The women walked with their heads held high, but every slight left its mark, carving them thinner, sharper. One evening, after returning with flour and salt, Eleanor lingered at the door before entering. She stood beneath the snow's hush, her breath rising like smoke, tears hidden by the darkness. Tahuya watched her from the corner of the cabin, his form half-shadow. He wanted to step forward, to place his hand on her shoulder, as he once had with his daughters when grief swallowed them. But his body would not move. Years of silence chained him in place. Still, when she entered, his eyes followed her, and when she bent to stoke the fire, he laid a thick fur across her shoulders. He said nothing, but her tears eased. Sometimes warmth spoke louder than words. The 3 of them began to develop a rhythm, a fragile family shaped not by blood but by need. Martha teased Tahuya when he returned from hunting, her laughter filling the cabin like sunlight-piercing clouds. Eleanor's gentleness smoothed the edges of silence, her quiet humming at night carrying notes of a life she had once known. Even Tahuya, though speechless, shifted slightly. His gaze lingered longer, his hands brushed theirs when passing a bowl, his breath softened when they laughed. Yet harmony could not hold against the world outside. In the saloon, Sheriff Briggs listened to Josiah Pike complain. "Ain't right," Josiah spat, slamming his cup down. "Those women living under a savage's roof. Sets a poor example." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. What they do on his land is his affair. But his tone carried unease. Order in town was a fragile thing, and whispers like this could turn into something harder, something dangerous. Back at the cabin, Martha stitched by the fire while Eleanor watched Tahuya mend his bowstring. The sight of his large, scarred hands moving with patience struck her with unexpected tenderness. She had been told men like him were beasts, unfit for trust. Yet here he was, holding life together with the same deliberate care she gave to thread and cloth. "Do you ever tire of their silence?" Martha asked suddenly, her eyes fixed on Eleanor. Eleanor blinked, then realized Martha meant not Tahuya's silence, but the silence they forced upon themselves, never answering the town, never crying out when insulted. She thought of the jeers, the cold glances, the sting of spit in the snow. "Every day," Eleanor said softly. "But if we answer, we give them more." She looked toward Tahuya, his white braid glowing in firelight. "If we endure, we keep what little dignity we have left. Tahuya lifted his head then, his dark eyes meeting hers. It was the first time she felt he truly looked at her, not through her, not past her. His gaze was heavy, but not crushing. It was recognition, as though he had heard every word she had not spoken aloud. The fire popped between them, carrying the sound of something fragile breaking open. That night, when the storm rattled the shutters, Eleanor dreamed of her husband's face. But instead of the fever's pallor, she saw the outline of the Comanche giant sitting by her hearth, steady as the mountains. She woke with her heart racing, torn between shame and a strange comfort. In the morning, Martha found her outside, staring toward the horizon where the town lay hidden in smoke. "It will not stop," Eleanor whispered. "The more we survive here, the louder they will grow." Martha's hand tightened on hers. "Then we will survive louder." Before Eleanor could reply, hoofbeats echoed across the frozen ground. 2 riders appeared on the ridge, watching the cabin. Their faces were shadowed by wide brims, but their presence was clear. The town had turned its whispers into watchful eyes. Inside, Tahuya rose from his stool, his frame filling the doorway as he looked toward the riders. His silence this time carried a different weight, not of grief, but of warning. The storm was no longer only in the sky, it had reached their very threshold. The sky bruised purple as the storm gathered, rolling low and heavy across the plains. Snow fell in thick sheets, swirling like ghosts around the cabin. Inside, the fire pulsed against the dark, a heartbeat of warmth in the frozen silence. Eleanor sat near the hearth, her needle tracing careful lines through a torn sleeve. Martha stirred the pot, her hands steady though her face was pale. Tahuya sharpened his axe by the door, each stroke slow, deliberate, the sound of metal against stone blending with the hiss of wind outside. The riders who had appeared on the ridge days before had not returned, yet their shadow lingered. Eleanor felt it whenever she closed her eyes, the memory of those figures watching from afar waiting. The town's whispers had sharpened into something harder. They were no longer content to mock from a distance. Judgment had saddled horses. When the storm struck at its fiercest, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the wind. The 3 of them lifted their heads at once. Martha's spoon clattered into the pot. Eleanor's hand froze mid-stitch. Tahuya set the axe aside, rose and moved to the door. He opened it to the blizzard, snow rushing in, and through the veil of white shapes emerged, lanterns swaying, torches spitting against the night. Men rode forward, their silhouettes stark against the storm's fury. Eleanor's breath caught. "They've come." Martha's face drained of color. She reached for Eleanor's hand, clutching it tight. The riders stopped a dozen paces from the cabin, their horses stamping restlessly in the drifts. At their head was Sheriff Briggs, his hat pulled low, his jaw clenched against the wind. Beside him, Josiah Pike held a torch high, its flame lashing in the storm. Around them gathered 6 others, men with hard eyes and colder hearts. "Bring them out," Briggs shouted over the wind. "They don't belong here." Tahuya stood shirtless in the snow, his breath steaming, his braid whipping behind him. He did not answer. His silence was more powerful than their noise, but the men did not see it as strength. They saw it as defiance. Eleanor stepped into the doorway, Martha at her side. The wind tore at their shawls, snow catching in their white hair until it shone like silver crowns. Eleanor's voice carried, though it trembled. "We are here by choice. We will not be moved." Pike sneered, his torchlight flickering across his face. "Choice? You shame yourselves, living with a savage. You shame this town." Martha's chin lifted, though her lips shook. "Better to share fire with him than poison with you." The men muttered, shifting uneasily, their torches casting wild shadows across the snow. Briggs raised his hand to silence them. "We won't let this stand. You come back to town with us, or we'll see to it that this cabin's nothing but ash by morning." The threat cracked through the night like a whip. Eleanor's heart pounded. She felt Martha's hand tighten, felt the storm biting her cheeks, but she did not step back. Instead, she moved forward until she stood beside Tahuya, her small figure dwarfed by his giant frame. Tahuya's silence wrapped around her like a shield. For a moment, she felt no fear. She felt the earth steady beneath her feet. Briggs' eyes narrowed. "You'd stand with him? Against your own kind?" Eleanor's voice rose, stronger now. "We are not yours to command. We've been cast out by you," spat on, shamed. "You left us to freeze. And he opened his door." Her hand trembled, but her words cut through the storm. "What does that say of you, Sheriff? And what does that say of him?" The storm howled louder, as if the heavens themselves leaned in to hear. The men shifted again, their certainty cracking beneath the weight of her words. Some lowered their eyes. Others tightened their grip on their reins, angry at their own hesitation. Josiah Pike spat into the snow. "She's bewitched, that's what. Both of them. Witches with silver hair, crawling under his roof." He raised his torch higher, flames spitting sparks into the wind. "Burn it out. Burn them all out." The horses stamped nervously, the storm pushing against them. The men looked to Briggs. For a moment, the sheriff hesitated, torn between law and the poison of gossip. Martha's voice rang sharp, steadier than her friend's. "You call us witches because it's easier than admitting we frighten you. We survived what you would not. You mock our hair, but it is the mark of endurance. You cast us aside, but we endure still. And now, you cannot bear to see us stand unbroken." Her words struck like stones against glass. Even through fear, Eleanor felt pride flare. For the first time since her husband's death, her heart lifted with the sense of being more than cast off, more than rejected. Tahuya's gaze swept the men, his silence deep as the earth beneath them. He stepped forward, bare chest gleaming with frost, his scars illuminated by torchlight. The storm whipped around him, but he stood unmoved, as though the storm itself bent to his stillness. His presence alone was answer enough. The men faltered. One lowered his torch. Another muttered, "Not worth it." But Josiah's hand shook with fury, his face twisted with shame disguised as anger. "If law won't act, I will." He thrust the torch forward, flame hissing against snow. In that instant, Eleanor felt the world narrow to a single breath. She saw the flame, saw the hatred in his eyes, and felt the cold bite deeper into her bones. She glanced at Tahuya, who had not moved, who stood as if he had been carved from stone itself. His silence was not retreat. It was waiting. The storm roared, a wall of white between them all. Snow stung her face, tore at her shawl, blinded her eyes. She could hear Martha's breath beside her, hear the restless hooves of horses, hear the crackle of fire as the torch drew closer. And still, Tahuya did not move. Then, through the howl of wind, came the sound of splintering wood, sharp, final, inevitable. The storm had ripped a branch from the great oak beside the cabin. It crashed into the snow between the riders and the lodge, sparks flying as it struck Pike's torch and snuffed the flame. The men shouted, startled, their horses rearing. For a heartbeat, silence followed, broken only by the storm. The torch lay extinguished in the snow. The branch steamed where fire had kissed it. Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs. She turned toward the sheriff, whose face was pale beneath his brim. He looked from the giant Comanche to the women with their silver crowns of hair, and his eyes faltered. The storm had delivered its verdict. But whether the men would heed it, none of them yet knew. The storm did not relent through the night. It clawed at the cabin walls, rattled the shutters, pressed its weight against the roof like a living thing. Inside, the fire burned low, its glow casting trembling shadows across three faces marked by resolve and exhaustion. Eleanor sat upright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Martha rested against her shoulder, eyes heavy but unyielding. Tahuya stood near the door, his massive frame blocking drafts, his silence carrying the gravity of a man preparing for whatever dawn might bring. When morning came, the storm broke into a brittle stillness. Snow lay deep and unbroken, a white shroud across the plains. Yet the quiet did not bring peace. Hoofprints marred the drifts leading to the ridge, a reminder that the town's men had left with anger unsatisfied. Eleanor knew they would return. Men who fed on pride and gossip did not easily swallow shame. They came before midday, a line of riders pushing through the snow with grim determination. Their torches were gone, but rifles gleamed in their hands. At their head rode Sheriff Briggs, his jaw set, his eyes shadowed by a weight heavier than law. Beside him, Josiah Pike rode with lips curled in hatred, his hand tight on the reins, his anger sharpened by humiliation. The cabin door opened, and the three stepped out together. Tahuya led, shirtless despite the cold, his white braid stark against his back. Eleanor and Martha flanked him, their shawls pulled tight, their silver hair catching the pale light until it seemed they wore crowns spun from frost. They looked like exiles no longer, like figures carved by survival into something untouchable. Briggs called out, his voice rough. "This ends now. The women come with us." Eleanor's chin lifted. She had been spat upon, cast aside, called witch and burden. For years, she had bent beneath shame. But no more. Her voice rang steady. "We are not yours to claim. We are not yours to discard. We stand where we choose." Martha's hand slipped into hers, firm and unwavering. "We will not be dragged back to cages you built for us with gossip and lies." Pike spat into the snow. "Then you'll die with him." His hand moved for his rifle. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. The horses snorted, their breath steaming. The men shifted, torn between fear and fury. Tahuya stepped forward, his bare chest steaming in the cold, scars mapping every loss he had endured. He did not reach for a weapon. His silence was his blade. His presence was his shield. The air seemed to thicken around him, and for an instant even the rifles faltered, as if the men feared they were aiming at something larger than flesh. Pike's fury broke the hesitation. He raised his rifle, his face twisted with hate. But before the shot could fire, Eleanor's voice cut the air. "Look at yourselves. You call us cursed, but it is you who burn with fear. You spit at women who live through more than you could bear. You tremble before a man who has harmed no one. And still you call yourselves righteous." Her words struck sharper than bullets. Even Briggs flinched. The men wavered, shame flickering through their hardened faces. The storm of gossip had carried them here, but the truth in her voice cracked their certainty. Martha added her voice, strong and clear. "You cannot drive us out, for we have already lived your exile. You cannot shame us, for we have worn your shame until it turned to silver in our hair. You cannot break us, for we are already broken, and yet still we stand." Silence fell heavy. The rifles lowered an inch. Briggs' eyes darted between them and Tahuya, whose stillness anchored the moment like a stone in a river. Pike snarled, his pride too brittle to bend. "Enough talk." He swung his rifle forward, finger tightening on the trigger. Then Tahuya moved. Not with violence, but with a step that closed the distance between him and the muzzle of the gun. His chest rose, broad and unyielding, his eyes locked on Pike's. He placed himself before the women, offering his body as shield. His silence roared louder than any threat, louder than any gunshot could have. The rifle shook in Pike's hands. For the first time he saw not a savage, not an enemy, but a man who had borne more grief than he could fathom, and who chose, even now, to protect rather than destroy. His hand faltered. The rifle dipped. Briggs raised his own hand, his voice hoarse. "Enough, Josiah." He turned his gaze on the women, then on Tahuya. Something in their faces, the dignity, the defiance, the unbroken silence, stripped him of the authority he clung to. "Let them be," he said finally, his words heavy with reluctant surrender. One by one, the rifles lowered. The men muttered, restless, ashamed. The storm inside them had broken, not with bullets, but with the weight of three figures who refused to yield. Pike cursed, turned his horse, and rode off into the snow. The others followed, their torches unlit, their pride smoldering in the cold. Briggs lingered a moment longer, then tipped his hat with a sigh that sounded like defeat, and followed after. The ridge emptied, leaving only silence. Snowflakes drifted down, soft as ash. Eleanor's breath trembled out of her chest. Martha's grip tightened before slowly easing. Together, they turned to Tahuya. He had not moved, still standing like a mountain before them, his breath rising steady, his scars glowing faintly in the pale light. For the first time, Eleanor reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His skin was warm despite the cold. Her voice was soft, but sure. You are not alone anymore. Martha nodded, her eyes bright with tears. Nor are we. For the first time in years, Tahuya's lips parted. His voice, low and rough from disuse, rumbled like distant thunder. Together. One word, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken: loss, endurance, the fragile hope of belonging. They turned back to the cabin, their steps slow but certain. The snow no longer felt like a shroud but like a cloak, wrapping them in the hush of a world remade. Inside, the fire welcomed them, its glow casting light on faces no longer marked only by grief but by dignity hard-won. And as the wind softened outside, the cabin stood firm, no longer a tomb of solitude, but a home reborn in the storm's aftermath.